It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce to everyone Jaakko Seikkula, psychologist and researcher, who's a key member of the original team in Western Lapland in Finland, developing the approach that became known as open dialogue, OD. I had mentioned this approach to a New York friend and colleague, Dan Mackler, who eventually went to Finland to make a film on open dialogue. Jaakko and his team have been doing research on the effectiveness of OD in persons experiencing distressing psychosis. He is also interested in looking at dialogue as a basic form of human life and therapeutic practice. I'm reminded of the saying from philosopher Martin Buber, which my partner Julie had on the banner at the front of their prose program in the Bronx that she directed, "All real living is meeting." Jaakko, I don't know if you ever heard that quote from Martin Buber. Yeah. Recently, Jaakko has been looking at embodiment and dialogue, how we communicate in our bodies and create a relational mind. I think you might, I don't know if you've had an opportunity to discuss with Galice and Mauricio Pichicha. They're doing a lot of work in that area, first on mirror neurons and forward. Jaakko is professor of psychotherapy emeritus at the University of Jyväskylä. Maybe
very good. Yeah.
In Agora, were you in Agora, the building? I think I've seen it.
Yes.
At the okay, and author of 2 books on dialogical practice, and co-author of about, this is very impressive, 190 papers. He has 2 chapters on open dialogue, one with Birgitta Alcara in Nick Putman and Brian Martindale's 2022 excellent edited volume published by Routledge, Open Dialogue for Psychosis, Organizing Mental Health Services to Prioritize Dialogue, Relationship, and Meaning. Without further ado, Jaakko Seikkula. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind words, Brian. And thank you for the invitation for this important Congress. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to share my experiences and my thoughts about the issues, how to improve dealing with the psychotic problems and how to make possible that also within the psychiatric system the need for these people would be acknowledged, because I have a feeling that during the decades of this neurobiological hysteria that has taken over in psychiatry, people who have got psychotic problems really have been abandoned. Also much part for the people as psychotherapists and family therapists, of course not we who are involved in the work of ISPS, but this process has been a very unhappy for our practice and for the field. I will start to share my screen. I will show some slides. I hope that you can both see myself speaking and the slides that I'm speaking. I've been involved in developing this practice that we started in the beginning to call family center practice, by starting to work as a clinical psychologist in a small psychiatric hospital in Lapland in Finland, early 80s, and then step by step that turned into something that we named as open dialogues in psychiatry. It's not only an approach to think about psychotic problems, because it's meant for all kind of mental health crises, but main part of the research and main part of the work of development we have done in having a new ideas how to meet with people who have psychotic experiences. And in the title I have tried to make 2 things very clear. For me, psychosis is a part of normal life, and for me dialogue is a part of normal life. And I think that the the outcomes that we have had in open dialogues are based on these two facts, in a way, if you can call that way. And we really have, I want to repeat very shortly, it is exceptional outcome. The latest outcome study that we have done includes a follow-up over 19 years. What has happened? How is the situation 19 years after the people had a help that is called open dialogue in Finnish Lapland? And we collected the data from 3 samples, 92 to 93, and the second sample 94 to 97, and the third sample then 10 years after 2003, 2005. And put all this together. And in this 3 sample, in a 2-year follow-up, we already saw a very remarkable outcomes in respect of how people with psychotic problem manage in their lives. We can see that, for instance, the use of medication, neuroleptic medication, was very small in the beginning and also in the follow-up. Has risen a bit in 2003, 2005, but that was perhaps more due to the fact that the psychotic crises were dissolved in so rapidly that those people who managed in, for instance, 2 sessions, they were no longer a part of this study. And as amazing results, we could see that 9 of 10 people could return to full employment in 2-year perspective. That was very different compared to how we know the situation is in the system of care on the whole. Then in this follow-up that was published 2 years ago, we really followed and made a comparison about this 108 people who came into the treatment in Western Lapland in the open dialogue system, and made a comparison, how is this in compared to the situation in the rest of Finland. This is a register-based information. In Finland, we have quite good access to have the registration of the use of healthcare. And we can see very significant differences. If we think about this, first of all, there is a change in statistics in the mortality by illnesses, but when we have a control of age, these differences no longer exist. People who are in the system of open dialogue come to the care system of care much earlier, which is a very fortunate situation because their problems do not have time to develop that severe. But we can see that in a treatment of usual context, almost all people are hospitalized more than 1 month, compared to 18% in the open dialogue care. After 20 years, half of the people still have an active contact in psychiatry. Half of the people had an active contact in psychiatry. That's pretty scary, compared to 28% in Lapland. More than 80% were still on medication in the treatment as usual. In Western Lapland, it was 1/3 or a bit more who were on medication. And the most striking difference is concerning the number of people living on a disability. When in the treatment of usual, more than 60% compared to 1/3 of the people in open dialogue, who had an open dialogue. This is not a follow-up study because we did not have control of their care after 2 first years. But still, what happened during the very first contact in psychiatry still is visible in their life, even if they have met perhaps new crises, even if they when they moved away from Lapland, they have met a very traditional psychiatry, but still the first experience was very decisive in their ways. And about the importance of dialogical experience, I shortly saw a letter of a psychiatrist, Jordi Marfa, who lives in Barcelona. And only to refer how surprising the meeting with dialogical practice can see. Jordi wrote that we met in some seminar, and he was encouraged after our conversation to start to work with his team. And he said that we made it possible. his very first cases that they described was working with a young woman who recently had her first psychotic period, and they formed a team. In open dialogue, it's very important that we work in team. In addition to him as a doctor, social worker and nurse, and in some meetings also psychologist who was an individual psychotherapist. So in open dialogue, it's an idea to integrate that there may be individual psychotherapy, there may be family meetings, and the therapists are invited to be in the shared meetings also. They had 20 meetings, and with the family, with her alone, her family, and some friends. It's also important that in open dialogue we are open to invite the resources from the social network to the shared meeting, family members, but in many cases also others who may contribute with new psychological resources. And then Jordi wrote, the result is absolutely shocking. Jordi had or have more than 40 years experience in psychiatry. He's also a psychoanalyst. But still he used a very strong word because something happened that they could not believe. We gave up the antipsychotic medication in 4 months. She found job. She obtained driving license and had begun her studies in the university. These are only very short examples of the let's say the effectiveness, and these put in front at least 2 questions. One of the questions is that how come the outcomes in open people who have had open dialogue care, both in respect of the studies and in respect of the clinical experience, are so advanced, and how come the outcomes are so poor of those who are in treatment as usual. And actually it's a very alarming that in 25 years or 30 years it seems that in a treatment of usual setting no progress has happened in respect of taking care of people who have psychotic problems. And this is the period of time with the strong emphasis of thinking that the medication is the only care that is needed. For me, thinking of psychotic problems, it's a very important to think about that in a new way our understanding of psychotic problems on the whole, because I think that these outcomes, because they are so different compared to how we are used to think within the psychiatric care systems, and also now confirmed in many studies, they made a question if we do not have an adequate understanding about the problems that people may have had. And it's very important to start to rethink the psychotic problems on the whole. And I suppose that to many of us is very familiar to think that psychosis not as a kind of psychopathological category of an illness. And I would say that psychosis as a category does not exist. There are no category of people that we could say that who have psychotic problems. They would be different compared to people who do not have psychotic problems. Actually, of course, there's a lot of studies that have tried to find some structural, some genetic, some elements that would make that distinction without finding that. And thinking of psychotic behavior, what is so important to start to think that psychotic behavior is not a symptom of some illness, but it's more a survival, embodied survival strategy of the mind to survive in a very strange experience. And what do I mean? I mean that when we meet, for instance, when we read textbooks in psychiatry of psychotic people, we may see descriptions how people have a specific logic of thinking and speaking and behaving, and by this are said that this is a kind of equivalence of the or elements of psychotic problems. But actually that is not the case, because we see the outcomes of the strategy that the people have created for themselves. And if someone, for instance, if I had started to hear voices being alone in a room, I suppose that I would be terrified and immediately start to create some strategy how to survive this experience. And what is most risky is the isolation, because many times people start to isolate themselves from social context. And in traditional psychiatry, in the treatment as usual, where there are no crisis intervention possibilities to meet people immediately after they have this kind of strange experiences, people have a very long time to be isolated and to create very strange survival strategies for themselves. People may have had psychotic problems 2 or 3 years before they first time come into any care. And if you think of long-standing situation and behavior, we many times hear that it's the deepness of the pathology. This is visible here, but in my mind, that's not the case. A long-standing and chronic situation with psychotic problems is a sign of failure of the care. And the failure of the care comes out of at least from 2 respects. First of all, the help, the treatment start all too late, so that people are really a long time alone and creating strange survival strategies. And the second is that if we have a non-adequate understanding of the problem, of the what is psychosis on the whole, and perhaps you could say that if we have this idea of pathologizing the problem and human life on the whole, it leads to a wrong treatment response. And to a wrong treatment response, for me in this respect, to think that the only treatment in psychotic crisis is to start immediately the medication and not to think about the other elements. I'm not at the moment I'm not speaking against of the medication, but I'm thinking of the practice. How do we use the medication in the help? So it is the psychological meeting. It is the stop the isolation that the people have that is most important in the crisis. To meet with the family, to meet with the social network, and encourage to start to speak about the situation. And if needed later on, of course, medication also can be used, as we saw in open dialogue, for instance, in the very beginning, about the 1/5 of the cases started the medication, even if the need of medication in our studies was much less than we expected. So if we have a psychological meeting, the need for medication seems to start to decline very rapidly. And following this, so thinking that of psychotic behavior as a psychological tool that we all of us can need if we are in a stressful situation enough in our life. And we know in many studies, and perhaps this is not even needed to repeat, that psychotic problems, or let's say hallucination, for instance, are more a kind of reaction of people who never have been in any contact in psychiatry. In hallucinations, people speak about real events, what has happened in their life, and many times these events include experience of being a victim of some traumatic incident. Not always, but many times. And it's a very embodied knowledge. It's a very embodied experiences. It is in a way of speaking and so experiencing something that is in the memory of body without any conscious words to deal with. And what is so important that it may be that the first psychotic experience may be the first possibility ever to share some of these terrifying experiences that people have. And that's why it is so important to listen carefully to understand what has happened in one's life and how to how these happenings are involved in her experiences, to acknowledge her experience without conditions. For me, as in many of us here, the work of Bertram Picaron has been very decisive. I was also very happy to be in collaboration with him, and only repeating very few ideas of his work. when Bertrand Picaron was speaking that creating hallucination is an active effort of the mind. I don't remember exactly if he was speaking so much as a mind of embodied nature, but it's my addition to the idea. And the idea is that in hallucination we can prevent something worse, we can prevent death. And as it was so clear in his works, also in hallucinations people speak of real incidents of life which need to be listened. For instance, in his book with Carrie van den Bos, they wrote an example of a young man who was so-called speaking languages, and as a therapist he started to make question and inquiry and found out that actually he was sexually abused by the priest earlier on in his life. And for him, having not the medication was a precondition to start the individual psychotherapy. Some 4 points about the practice in open dialogue concerning how to deal with psychotic experiences. What is perhaps worth of saying and also important to share here is that when we speak of open dialogue practice, we do not only speak of practice of psychotherapists, single psychotherapists, but we speak of the practice of the entire system, and the entire system is involved in the care by working as teams. And in this work, what is important first is to having the relational focus all the time, which means that we are very keen to start to work together with the family members and the social networks to prevent and stop the process of isolation, which in my mind is the biggest risk to be chronified in psychotic problems in a very horizontal way. So inviting family members, and if they are not present, to ask about them, and also vertically in the conversation, including the voices of those nearest to the patient all the time. For instance, by asking simply, if your mother would have been with us here now, what would she say about the situation that you are describing? And in this way to invite the experiences of his or her most important relation in her life to be part of this. And you could say that that working in this relational way, one of the ideas is to increase the acceptance and respect to each other within the family, so that we can start to speak, for instance, with the voice of the father, who he is speaking that he was very condemning. You start to make perhaps step by step also some other elements of the comments of the father. And of course, if we are present in the meeting, by having a respectful way to listen to all the point of views of everyone, can also make possible for the one who has not behaved in a very constructive way to start to change his or her behavior. The second part is to have all the way through the idea of respecting the experiences of each other without any conditions, without putting any questions mark about how he or she is living her life. Taking seriously everything that is said, and definitely not to look at the pathological part. Once I was invited in a seminar, there were a lot of professionals, also academic professionals, and I got questions that I felt myself very uncomfortable. What is your clinical theory of schizophrenia? They said that I couldn't find an answer, and then I realized that why I don't have an answer to this question is that I never in my meetings have spoken with schizophrenia patients, because I always speak with human beings. And if someone has diagnosis or not has diagnosis, it really is not an important, because in every meeting what is important is to meet with her experiences, and to have curiosity on how she is his life, and not to try to find reasons to define her experiences as pathological. It's also important to realize that this experience may include hallucination, for instance, which means that it's another type of observation about the lived life. And it's also someone are against of making diagnosis, and I'm also against of making a kind of diagnosis from above. But being in meetings, it's very important to realize that people may start to speak in a way that may include hallucination, that may include psychotic experiences, because it really affects the conversation. So it's very important to be aware of those experiences. And the third point is that in the conversation, in the dialogical practice, perhaps more and more lately, this was not there in the very beginning, but lately my emphasis is on feelings and the affective part of experience. For instance, this idea concerns of actually any kind of meetings, any kind of problems that we may meet with the clients, but especially if we are dealing with extreme stories that may also scare us as a clinicians, as a therapist. And they may also increase feeling of powerless if we, for instance, are in a risk to come into a debate if these paranoid thoughts are really real or if they are not real. So it's a very important point at that moment to start to speak about the affective experience. This has definitely been hard for you. Could you tell me more about how do you feel about this being threatened, instead of going on with the debate of if this really has happened or if this really not has happened. And the fourth point is to think and emphasize the importance of the present moment here and now. Meaning that actually in a dialogical practice, you could say even that the stories that the people tell are not that important. That is what happens here and now when he or she is telling about the stories and we are responding to those. Because in this conversation, a new reality is created. And many times, as it happens in our conversation, the psychotic talk appears at the moment when the most important topics of his or her life are handled, which do not yet have any words to handle. And that moment is it's very important to take into account, because at that moment we may have access, we in a way can open the window to that part of the experiences that was not possible to deal before doing that. I give you two examples about this kind of conversation. These are published in some of the papers that we are writing to make it a bit more understandable. I need to follow the what's on the bottom of my screen. That's why I made the change. So this is an example of a meeting with young man who came into a mental health outpatient clinic. And these are very first minutes, and this is an example of the conversation in which in the conversation he becomes psychotic. And in this meeting I happened to be there. There was a nurse and there was a doctor and myself. And the one refers to the nurse who first said, "Where should we start?" And his name, let's say his auntie, he said, "I can't really remember anything of my whole life." And she said, "Has it been like this for a long time now that you can't remember anything?" Repeating word by word what something says is a very important part for the dialogical practice, for the shared experience. He went on, "Well, I don't know if it has been that way for 2 months. I do remember whether I've been in contact with someone, but when I leave the place, I don't even know if I was there, and where I might suddenly pop up is here." "With whom are you living?" the doctor asked. "I've been living myself, but now I've gone to my parents." "And for how long time you have been living by yourself?" 3 years. 3 years. "Whose idea was it to come here?" "My mother's." "And what was mother worried about?" "I don't know if I've been talking with her. I can't really remember anything. I have a feeling that I have even hit someone, but I can't even remember. Has someone said that you know, but I'm a paranoid and lost my memory, you think that something has happened. In this sequence, you can realize that he's speaking about experience that may have included psychotic experiences, but he is not psychotic because he can give a very understandable report. But all of a sudden, this is changed. The nurse asked, "What about your father? Is he worried about some specific issue?" "I don't know, but yesterday night when we were watching TV, he went to bed and in the morning he left to work." "And what was the situation when you returned home?" "Well, I was afraid of others. I was quarreling with these kind of guys and afraid of them. They had keys made onto my place and then they came in and raped me and I did all these things." This is a very friendly word, rape, because he used very, very, very aggressive language while describing what happened. "In May, I was living in my apartment. You see, someone who came into my flat had they been blackmailing or something and forced to steal the key," and so on and so on. All of a sudden, what happens that he is psychotic. And this seemed to appear after the question about the father. And later on in the process, there were a lot of evidence that the issue in respect of father was very sensitive in this family. There was a lot of hidden concern of the alcohol use of father. Father also, as a part of the process, tried to commit a suicide and so on. And now in the meeting, the topic of father was a kind of a way to have to start to speak in a psychotic way. And these kind of things happen, especially in a crisis in the first meeting, and we should be very keen to hear them and see how they affect. And I will give another example. That's also an example that I'm used many times, but it's a very good example to illustrate what happens if we do not manage to be present in the moment. And this was a meeting with a young man, Pekka, who had been violent towards his mother. And he gave a kind of description of what has happened. He said, "Well, it all happened last week, and the police came to us. She was drunk," speaking about his mother, "when she didn't say anything and started to make coffee in the middle of the night, and I asked. I went out and came into the kitchen and she turned round and said that it wasn't allowed to speak about it. Then I slapped her. She ran out into the corridor and started screaming. I said that there is no need to scream, that why can't she say? And then I calmed down. At that point I got the feeling and the police came and the ambulance. But in some way I have a feeling that it is, of course, it's not allowed to hit anyone, but there are our situation." And the response to the therapist, "What was the point? Was that the point when you went into the primary care?" In the end of his expression is his utterance. He started to reflect of his own behavior, first giving a description and then starting to speak. And of course, it's not allowed to hit anyone. But what happened was that the team was so interested in what happened there when all this happened, and they did not pick up his reflections. And it goes on in the next part, went on, "Yes, it happened just before that." Pekka continued, "Why did she not say that the police came? Why did she not say that police had been at your place the previous night?" "It wasn't the previous night, it was last weekend. I was thinking all the time, I'm thinking those strange things, and I knew that they were not true. But when you think about them for a while, after that you have the feeling that things like that can really happen. It's too much. You're only thinking of all kinds of futile things." And then the comment of the therapist. And it all started last week in this situation. In this comment, Pekka started to speak about his psychotic experience, strange thoughts. But again, when the team was so interested in what has happened there, they did not hear his comments and they did not comment on that. And this is a very dramatic situation because never after Pekka was willing to speak about his hallucinations or his psychotic experience. So the window was open once to deal with these experiences, but when the team was not present in this moment, the possibility was lost forever. And of course, I think that this is what the system on the whole so many times on the whole does for the people who have psychotic experiences, and this is the opening the way to be chronified to the problems. In open dialogue, as I said, that it's not only a practice of one therapist or two therapists, it's a question to organize the entire system or part of the entire system to work in an optimal way to make the dialogue possible, to hear all the voices. And we have created principles in one study that it's so important that the help emerge immediately within first day after the contact. It's so important we all the way through have a social network perspective, meaning that we always invite the family and some cases the rest of social network to be part of the system. It's so important that we are flexible to use and choose the methods of care that best fit for the family. Our very good friend Yrjö Alanen with his team created this need-adapted care, and this is exactly that point, that we do not only choose, for instance, dialogical meeting, we can include work with occupational therapists, we can use medication, there are need to have individual psychotherapies in some cases and so on. And what is so challenging for the system to take the responsibility and guarantee the psychological continuity. Responsibility is an idea to be all the way through available for the cases, for the people who are in need for help, for the one that we call as the patient and the family members. And for every case, a kind of case-specific team is formed to make possible to follow the situation as long time as needed. It's not only working in crisis, but this team can follow for 2 meetings or for 3 years. And in the end, to create safety enough that people can tolerate the uncertainty, that there are no ready-made responses. That's why we focus on dialogues. And what is dialogue here? I have taken a citation from Mikhail Bakhtin, who for me has been the main important philosopher to open the door to understand the power of dialogue. And of course, people have a lot of make a comparison of the writings of Bakhtin and Martin Buber. Actually, Bakhtin have reported being once, for instance, to listen to Martin Buber, his lecture. And Bakhtin says that dialogue here is not the threshold to action, it is the action itself. It's not a means for revealing, for bringing to the surface the already made character of a person. No, in dialogue, a person not only shows himself outwardly, but he becomes for the first time that which he is. And we repeat, not only for others, but for himself as well. To be means to communicate dialogically. So for Bakhtin, dialogue is life. Life is dialogue. And he also used very strong utterances saying that outside the dialogue is death. Dialogue is a part of life in which we enter in the very first inhaling in our life. And of course, now we know that it's a very concretely true in the development of life. We make initiative, we get responses, and in those responses we learn to know ourselves, not only for others, but for ourselves also. In the very end of my speech today, I tried to conclude that what makes this kind of work in psychotic crisis, what are the very core elements to make it so effective? And I think that if these 4 elements are included in the care on the whole, we can expect better outcomes than we are used to think. First of all, having immediate response so that people really do not have time to isolate themselves and create a strange survival strategy. When we meet immediately, we meet with him and his family or her family in an emotional turmoil, and we meet with the affective elements of the crisis, which is the best situation to meet because everything is open with the strong affects. And it's so important that we include the one, for instance, who has psychotic experience into the meeting even if he could be agitated, and not to wait him or her becoming more coherent to be able in family meetings. And second, that we always include the family and the social network, and to have a kind of to be polyphonic in due respect. We meet with those people who are most relevant in the life of the one who are in the key person in the crisis, and we also invite her inner voices about the life of the others, because life is and the mind is constructed in the relations. I think that this is perhaps the most decisive difference of open dialogue into any other approaches that I need in meeting with most severe mental health problems, to be very consistent, to work with families and social networks, even if you would have an idea that relationship has been harmful. Now we can have access to make harmful relationships non-harmful, and possibility to people to learn new ways of dealing with each other. And the third point is the focus on dialogues in the meeting, because I suppose that only if we work in a dialogical way, we can have a keen interest of all the voices, everyone's voices, even if they would be very contradictory to each other. And of course, the fourth point is that while doing so, we have a lot of evidence that we can avoid the unnecessary use of psychosis medication that may affect and have many harmful effects on the life. In the very end, as I love to end my speech speaking of love, because when we come into the dialogical way of working, as I said, it's not a very specific tool. It's a part of life of everyone. We come to near or basic values in human life. We are no longer so interested of thinking that this is some specific method. And of course, there is no more basic element than love. And it's David Peterson, is a literature researcher who formulated this in a so nice way when he said that love is the life force, the soul, the idea. There is no dialogical relation without love, just as there is no love in isolation. Love is dialogic, he said.